and better non-core topic.
We place each blade one at a time.
Hi, sorry guys, deeply sorry. We'll start in 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Thank you so much. So we start anyways. On the call with us is Ifeanyi. I deeply apologize for this glitch. Ifeanyi is a facilitator for the course climate change and human rights. Ifeanyi is a globally recognized energy professional, sustainability consultant, and impassioned climate leader, renowned for his extensive work in environmental advocacy and corporate sustainability. Ifeanyi transformative leadership is evident in its efforts beyond the spheres of youth advocacy, advocating, extended into reforming business approaches within Nigeria's sustainability sector. Ifeanyi possesses a distinguished knack for guiding businesses towards embedding sustainability in their core strategies, which has contributed to his clients garnering both local and international recognition for their outstanding sustainability performance. Ifeanyi's accolades and achievements are testament to his relentless pursuit of climate action. Recently, he was instrumental in developing the African Youth Sustainability Action Plan unveiled at the COP17 at the COP27 in Sharm el Sheikh, Egypt. Ifeanyi is a proud member of the United People Global Sustainability Leadership Class of 2022. He has also represented the younger generation at international platforms as a delegate at the United Nations Climate Change Conference 2021 in Glasgow, funded by the Rockefeller Foundation and Sustainable Energy for All. Previously, Ifeanyi participated in the Student Energy Leadership Fellowship 2021 Canada and the Climate Reality Leaders Corps in 2020, where he was trained by Al Gore, a former Vice President of the United States of America. His extraordinary efforts in the domain of climate change action are a source of inspiration and a call to action for everyone. Personally, Ifeanyi has been an inspiration for me, a senior colleague. If I can say that he introduced me to this whole subject of climate change, sustainability, and environment. Without taking much of our time again, I'd like to welcome Ifeanyi to our class today. Thank you very much. Ifeanyi. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you once again. Thank you so much, Maiwa, for that introduction. And hello, everyone. Good morning. I'm so excited and delighted to be in this class this morning. Of course, we had a conversation on Monday, and today we'll be continuing with that conversation. And I believe this is the 8th week of the program so far, and it has been full of so many insights and so much has been said so far. And today we're going to be talking on climate change and human rights. Please, I want to see some reactions. I also want to see the chat box popping. How are we feeling this morning? I hope we are in the mood for a conversation on human rights. And of course, would like this to be as interactive as possible. I believe on Monday, when we had the call, about 6 African countries were represented. I want to believe that we also have people from across different countries represented on this call. So please, if you could just share where you're from, what your name is and where you're from, that would help keep the conversation as engaging as possible. Thank you, Adobe. I see your comment. So before we dive into what we have for today, I think it would be of value to just do a brief recap of what we touched on in the last class on Monday, and just like to jog our memories on what we discussed, and also for the benefit of those who may not have been on the call on that day. So we could just have a brief rundown of what we discussed. I also need you to put in the chat box while you're introducing yourself. I see the chat comments are coming in, and I appreciate that. Maybe you could also share 1 or 2 things that stood out for you on Monday as we had the conversation, as we go through the review. So on Monday, we started off by talking about climate change and how it's like refers to a long-term shift in temperature and weather patterns. We talked about the drivers of climate change and how climate change affects us as a people, right? Then we talked about the interwoven nature of climate change and also how there are different perspectives to the conversation. We briefly touched on the economics of climate change and how people look at it from the cost benefit approach. I think I remember giving a case study of the United Kingdom, and given an example of when I arrived. I was in a wine tasting event, and the host was speaking about how traditionally you have wines produced in Spain, in the south of France, and all of that, because the climate there is favorable. But due to the changing climate in the United Kingdom, it's warming up, and that simply means that the environment is becoming even more friendly for the production of grapes, which of course are used to produce wines. So the United Kingdom's climate is becoming more favorable, and that's leading to a boom in wineries and vineyards that produce wines. So this is like a positive outcome for the United Kingdom economically as far as climate change is concerned, but also there's negative impacts where you see increased warming leading to more bizarre weather events. You hear about heat waves and all of that. So these are some negatives. So, and the economics viewpoint, we look at the costs and the benefit approach and try to see, okay, how does it, what are the impacts and what are the positive effects as well. So that's just looking at it from the economics viewpoint. Then we have the security viewpoint, and of course we know that climate change has kind of a multiplier effect that leads to instability, and we gave instances of regions that have significant instability security-wise due to underlying effects that have linkages to climate change. And then we talked about the ecological approach, human-induced climate change, of course, what we know as the Anthropocene. Of because human beings are becoming more and more, having more and more impacts on the climate as we know it, and how ecosystems are affected. Talk about great extinctions, talk about ecosystems suffering significantly due to the changing climate. And then we moved on to spotlight human rights, the perspective of human rights, and we said that it has not gotten as much attention as it should, because it has to do with human beings, right? And the rights of human beings. And if we look at it from that perspective, then we can sense the urgency and sense the dangers. And then we talked about the Stockholm Declaration of the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment. And that declaration, or that principle kind of guides how we view climate change and human rights. So the principle states that man has the fundamental right to freedom, to equality, and adequate conditions of life in an environment of equality that permits a life of dignity and well-being. And it bears a solemn responsibility to protect and improve the environment for present and future generations. So we have that right to an environment that permits a life of dignity. So we also ask the question, the location where you find yourself, does the environment permit you to live a life of dignity and well-being? Or are you a victim of your environment? And if you are a victim of your environment, then climate change may be one of the reasons why you find yourself in that situation. And if you can draw those linkages and draw those parallels, then you understand why climate change has an impact on human rights. We also talked about some philosophical principles that was to guide our conversation. We looked at 4 components when we were discussing human rights. We looked at the humanity viewpoint, which basically refers to says that human rights refers to those rights that we enjoy by virtue of our humanity. And we looked at the work of Mr. H.L.A. Hart, how we distinguish between special rights and general rights. And I recall us saying that special rights are those rights you enjoy by virtue of some action, and so that either you have done or another party has performed. An example would be signing a contract. The dividends of that contract, you benefit from it, is a special right that you enjoy. And then general rights are those that you enjoy. Just to confirm, can you still hear me?
Yes, sir, we can hear you, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. So I was saying special rights are the rights that you enjoy by virtue of some action that either you have performed or another party. And then the general rights are the rights that you enjoy by virtue of your humanity. So a special right too can be a right you enjoy because you were born in a particular country, and then you enjoy the rights of citizenship, right? That's a special right. But general rights are right to live and right to breathe, right of association and all of that. So looking at it in that perspective, you can say that human rights falls under that category of the rights that you enjoy by virtue of your humanity and what kind of accrues to every single person. We then talked about the moral thresholds, where we spoke about the basic how basic rights are the morality of the depths. That's the line beneath which no one is allowed to sink. So there are certain things you see, and when the situation escalates to a particular level, you say, okay, this is not dignifying. This line should not be crossed. So if you see someone in your locality, a petty thief who steals, and then the person is being dehumanized, you see the person being maybe stripped naked and paraded in the marketplace, you look at it and morally you feel that this is dehumanizing, this is a line that should not be crossed, or maybe jungle justice, people decide to take the law in their hands and to lynch somebody, that is dehumanizing. So that line, the morality of the depths talks about that line beneath which no one is allowed to sink. And then we ask ourselves the question, due to the challenges or due to the complexities of climate change and the implications of climate change, are we finding ourselves sinking even below that depth or below that line? And that's where we talk about the moral threshold. Then we talked about universal protection. And universal protection just basically has to do with how there is an obligation to respect the basic minimum standards, and there cannot be any trade-offs. There cannot be any trade-offs as far as human rights is concerned. And then we talked about lexical priority. So lexical priority is just talking about in the event that there is the government, let me give an instance. If the government is trying to promote the welfare of people or welfare of the community or society, can they afford to do that while violating human rights? In the event of such a conversation, human rights must take priority. So that's what lexical priority talks about. And then we talked about vulnerable people. We talked about vulnerable groups, of course, women, children, and those in indigenous communities fall under the group of those who are vulnerable. We had an extensive conversation about that. And then we had another, I think we also discussed the non-identity problem. It was a paradox that was posed to us. And then we had a conversation about that and counter that paradox. So yeah, so because of our time, I think we can jump into what we have today. I don't know if people have been dropping their what they learned from the conversation on Monday, but we will be talking today about some case studies, and then we will be more action oriented. We'll talk about, of course, last time we talked about some of the organizations or the institutions' global response to climate change and human rights issues. So Mariwa, if you don't mind, can you please share the slides and have it?
Okay, I'll do that now.
Yeah,
I'll do it now.
we can start from case study 1, if that's okay.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So just a brief second.
That's all right.
Right.
Okay. Thank you very much. So
Okay.
we can talk about some case studies that just show or demonstrate the impacts of climate change and how it affects the human rights of people in Africa. So the first case study is the impact of drought on food security in Somalia. And perhaps we all on this call may be aware that Somalia has experienced severe droughts in the past decade. So the decade is 10 years. So for a long period of time, Somalia has been experiencing severe droughts. So for those who may not know, Somalia is located in an area called the Horn of Africa. And the Horn of Africa is known, when you're talking about shipping routes, it is known as one of the most dangerous shipping routes or areas in the world. I don't know how many people have seen the movie Captain Phillip. I want to see the chat popping. Has anyone seen that movie?
I've actually seen it. Tom Hanks.
Yes,
Right.
exactly.
Tom Hanks.
Yeah, he
It
is
is
the
Tom
one.
Hanks.
Yeah, Captain Phillip. So I saw that movie. I think it came out in 2013, and I saw the movie. And in the movie, it was basically talking about the state of Somalia and how piracy had increased in the country due to hunger, due to droughts, and in that movie, what basically happened was a ship, an American ship, was captured. I think it was a vessel that was transporting goods. It was captured, and this became the business of these Somalians who are taken to piracy because they just needed to fend for themselves, and the area was becoming increasingly unstable. So there was a lot of they had a lot of gangs and all. So the ship was captured basically, and from that movie, I think that was the first time I had a picture of what was going on in Somalia. However, there was something that was driving that. The insecurity in the land came about by severe drought. Drought is one of the effects of climate change, right? And because the people who may have been farmers or fishermen or had like some profession that they were using to keep themselves occupied, and because of the impacts of drought, they may have lost all that, and then food prices are high, skyrocketing, and these people just have to find a way to live. So there's significant pressure on them, and then they go into these crimes that I've just explained. But it's very, very easy to start and say, oh, these people are known for piracy, and these people are known for stealing ships and stealing the goods on ships, or kidnapping sailors and people who ply that route. And this is what they do: they extort them, get money. But it would be a travesty not to begin the conversation from the underlying causes. Because one thing I also want us to understand is that though Africa suffers significantly from climate change, the effects of climate change, Africa contributes very little to climate change. And on Monday, we talked briefly about the causes of climate change, and we said that it's due to the increase of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and that is trapping more heat. And the warming of the globe is causing all these effects. It leads to all these effects. But Africans don't drive the most cars. Of course, it's the fossil fuels that are burned in these vehicles contribute. Africans don't have as much access to electricity. Africans are contributing just about roughly 3%, yet they suffer the most. And it leads these people it puts them into so much pressure that they begin to live alternative lifestyles or live just to survive. And this is a security dimension, but it also has a human rights dimension to it. If you look at the number of people who die, it says in 2011, a severe drought and famine affected over 4 million people, leading to the death of tens of thousands, mostly women and children. So when you just put this number into perspective, over 4 million people are affected. And then you put in the conversation of, say, the Captain Phillips movie where you have pirates. Perhaps those pirates, I'm not holding brief for them, but I'm just putting things into perspective. Perhaps they are in a situation where they have to kill or be killed, eat or be eaten. And these are some of the pressures that climate change brings about. So The impact of droughts, of course, definitely leads to food insecurity, and that is a clear violation of the human rights, because we have a right to food. We have a right to eat. We have a right to survive. But when that right is deprived from us, then we are sinking below that line. Remember what I mentioned earlier about the morality of the debt. So that is it. Yes, the movie is based on a true story. You can check it out. It was quite interesting. All right, let's look at the second case study. And while we're having these case studies, I also want us to think about our localities and how the conversation ties to your locality. And what we want to achieve from examining these case studies is to get you to reflect, because it's very easy for us to be far removed from these realities. Perhaps where you are staying, you don't have these experiences. Maybe you don't suffer severe drought, or you don't have your city or your town flooded. So it's very easy for you to block it out of your mind. But what we want to do is to spotlight these issues so that we see how it directly affects us or affect people around us. And when we do that, we become empathetic to their cause. And that drives us to take action. That's why we're considering these case studies. Maiwa, please, if you could move to the next slide. Thank you. Okay. The second case study is the impact of flooding on housing and health in Nigeria. In 2012, there was a great flooding that happened in Nigeria, and over 2 million people were affected. It led to people being displaced. About thousands of people were displaced from where they were living, and properties were lost, lives were lost. Over 2 million people. I don't know about you, but when this happened in my own community, a lot of people, I think half of the town was underwater. Half of the town was underwater. Why? Because we have a lake, a natural lake there, and that lake, of course, had these ecosystem benefits to us. My people are predominantly fishermen and farmers, but when we had this great flood, half the town was underwater. Luckily for my family, our family house is on a hill, so it wasn't submerged, but we were also affected because there's so much pressure on the facilities that kind of are above water, because every person is coming there. There's so much pressure. It was overwhelming because the state agency that was responsible for emergency, they were overwhelmed. Who do we take care of? Who do we abandon? Women and children affected. A lot of camps were set up as relief camps. So when these things happen, when these disasters happen, it affects people. And 2 million is not just a number. 2 million, these are 2 million different stories. These are 2 million different lives that have been altered one way or another. I remember at a few Olympic Games ago, there was a special category carved out for those who were refugees. Refugees, they were brought to compete in the games. And I liked that because it drew the world's attention. You know, in this world, we have become masters at hiding what is inconvenient, sweeping it under the carpet. When you hear conversations about climate change, it's inconvenient to talk about, it's inconvenient to consider. So we just sweep it under the carpet and we just focus on the things that interest us, our football games, our sports, our politics, the things that interest us. We focus on them. But the things, real issues, nobody wants to discuss them. Nobody wants to discuss the disasters that are going on. So when I saw that in the Olympics, refugees got to compete, I was happy. And I listened to the story of one of them. This woman had to swim. I don't know. I think she was lost at sea or something. I can't really remember the story clearly. But she was lost at sea. She was stranded, and she had to swim like great distances to stay alive, right? And I was like, okay, so these are the things that are happening in areas that I don't know. I think it was Yemen or something. I can't remember the exact picture of what it was. But the story was quite strong. And the point I'm trying to make from this is that when people are displaced like that, there is a ripple effect. And at this point, I want to draw our attention to what's going on in Europe. So in Europe, there is a case of people emigrating into or migrating into Europe illegally through the Mediterranean. And this has become a global issue, a cause for concern. And everyone is talking about how the borders of Europe need to be tightened, how there's so much pressure from immigrants, and on and on and on. But the reason why there is so much pressure is because in the places where these people are coming from, it has become impossible to live. They have lost that right, that human right, a right to a decent place to rest your head, a right to having food on your table, a right to breathing clean air. They've lost that right, and automatically they have to move. So as a people, we need to start thinking, do we need to wait till these issues happen before we take action? Or can we start taking actions now? Because one thing I want to guarantee you is that if you think we've seen the worst of climate change, that's a big lie. We haven't. We haven't seen the worst of climate change yet. As the globe continues to warm, of course, we want to limit the warming to about 1.5 to 2 degrees. But if we continue on our current trajectory, we may hit even 4. And if we hit 4 by the year 2100, many of the cities, many of the coastal cities you know today and you celebrate today as wonderful places would be underwater. The population is still going to grow. So imagine how much pressure would be on the places that are inland. So these are some of the things that we need to think about. And as we think about this, maybe put ourselves in the shoes of these people, then it can prompt us to take action. Thank you so much, Elsie. Yes, the swimmers. Yes, there's also a movie about it, The Swimmers. So you can check that out. All right, let's look at the next case study. The impacts of rising sea levels on livelihoods in Egypt. So Egypt is facing the threat of rising sea levels, which are expected to inundate coastal areas, destroy the agricultural land, and contaminate freshwater sources. Yes, sea level rise is one of the impacts of climate change. And when this happens, the coastal areas would suffer the brunt of it. That reminds me of something that happened, I think, in 2015. So the president of one of the island countries, I think it's Kiribati. That's the name of the country. The former president of Kiribati, that's Anon Tong. He had to buy land in Fiji which is another country, as an insurance policy. And he calls this, he's the one that pioneered the idea of migration with dignity. And the reason why he bought that land is because due to climate change, his country people would be in trouble. The country was going to be submerged. And the reason why he bought that land, a large expanse of land in another country, so that when this happens, they could move to another place. So that's how bad it has become. And this man, a visionary, thinking about the survival of his people, has bought land in another country. So this just puts things into perspective that climate change is an existential threat. And when you say existential threat, it means that it threatens our very existence. So our right to live is questionable. There's no guarantee that we are going to survive, that we're going to live. And this man was taking action. It was very good that he had that vision and foresight to purchase land, but it just shows you the extent of devastation that people are suffering. So in Egypt, they are losing their coastal areas. Of course, agricultural produce is being lost. Fresh water contaminated. You can't drink water because it's basically seawater that has been polluted. A country that is GDP is dependent on tourism and agriculture, suffering. Nobody wants to come to your place when it's messed up, when it has become inundated by floods. All the hotels, all the resort centers will close down. Those coastal cities are only beautiful when everywhere is stable. When there's no flood, when there's no typhoon, that's the only time when people can come and relax in your country and enjoy your hospitality. But when the floods come, no one is thinking about that. So climate change is hitting virtually every area of our lives, hitting the economy, hitting infrastructure, hitting us socially, because these people, of course, their way of life, tourism and all of that. So these are social, there's a social link to it. So it's hitting us virtually everywhere. And the amount of attention we are paying to climate change is not commensurate. And that's why we must think, what can we do? What actions can we take? If you can move to the next slide, please. Okay, the Lake Chad Basin. This Lake Chad Basin is also in Nigeria. It cuts across about 4 countries, Nigeria, Niger, Chad, and Cameroon. And is one of the areas that is also suffering from the adverse effects of climate change. So in Lake Chad used to be one of the biggest lakes around in Africa. But since the 1960s, the Lake Chad began to shrink and shrink and shrink. And today, the Lake Chad Basin is a shadow of what it used to be. Of course, these countries depended on that lake for water resources, for irrigation, and all. And due to the shrinking of that lake, the region has been suffering severe food insecurity. People have had to move. Cattle, the people there have become nomadic, having to travel great distances to find enough pasture for their cattle. And this has had its impact as well on security, because as they move, they're also encroaching into farmlands and having clashes, communal clashes with the local farmers in those regions. And it's a whole mess. For those who are Nigerians, you may be familiar with the story and how that migration has also kind of precipitated into a migration of terrorists. Terrorists also take advantage moving. And also, as we mentioned on Monday, when you have a situation whereby the people are impoverished and cannot earn a decent living, then the temptation to become terrorists or to engage in vices becomes very high. It becomes very high. So little wonder why that region is also a hotbed for terrorism. Climate change is not just an agent of devastation or destruction. It also empowers us to destroy ourselves. Because the climate change, the flooding, the typhoons and the rest is not just killing people. The effect of it is forcing human beings to become terrorists and also wreak havoc upon themselves. So that's why the onus is on governments to be more proactive in their thinking. You see government officials come in and they are only talking about how to better the economy and how to do this and how to do that, looking at the GDP. And they don't mind if what they are doing to better the GDP or improve their numbers revolves around polluting and also facilitating or fast-tracking the changing of our climate. They don't care about that. If we have to dig more oil wells, if we have to flare more gases, they don't care. But the thing is, when climate change hits back, when the earth hits back, it rolls back every form of development you have done in the past 15 years. It renders it useless. It renders it useless. And that's why in our thinking, in our actions, we also need to consider the environment. We need to consider the climate. Let us move on to the next slide. I don't know if anyone has anything to say, any questions to ask at this point before we continue the conversation, or any reflections that they want to share. Maybe there are also impacts on your own community, that, or you have any lived experience that you want to share with us before we continue the conversation.
So I can say hand up. So let's take George from Ghana. Quick one. If I'm seeing a name here on Zoom that is not properly named, please, it's 804399. Please try and rename your Zoom. So let's take George from Ghana, reflecting
Hello?
on what's, yeah, okay.
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah.
All right,
Good
go on,
morning.
please.
Please, can you hear
Yeah,
me?
George, go on. Yes,
Right.
you're audible.
Yes. I'm speaking from Takrady, from the western part of Ghana, and the experience I want to share is along the coastal areas of the western, where the fisher folks are working, and there's this influx of sargassum seaweeds, which used not to be part of their engagement. But then this has come and they are putting so much blame on the production or the discovery of oil production. But then as part of my work on the ground, literature also reveals that this is not only in the western part of Ghana, but around the Caribbean and in the Atlantic Ocean, in other parts of the world, also suffer these sargassum seaweeds. So there has been much education also to the fisher folks with regard to climate change as some of these things happening. So what we have also done was also to look at how best we can turn these seaweeds into other useful alternative ventures for the fisher folks, who also complain that the seaweeds entangle their nets, and also when they arrive at the coastal communities, the beaches, it also gets them to suffer or face other challenges in terms of decay, decomposition, and smell, and sometimes cause irritation when they touch them. So what we also did was to turn these sargassum seaweeds into bricks, and now we are using it as part of construction hydroform bricks for the fishmongers along the coastal communities. The other one too is we turn the seaweeds into organic fertilizer, but then our donor asked us to suspend that whilst we do a thorough scientific analysis for to back our activity. And we did that with the Center for Scientific and Industrial Research, and the results have been very positive. So going forward, we are looking at how best we can scale this up to support the fisher folks along the coastal communities. So the effect of climate change is very diverse, and in the western coast are also experiencing their portion of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George, for sharing. That's interesting. I also like that you're taking the initiative. So that's an example of climate adaptation, finding ways to adapt and ensure that you turn the stumbling blocks into stepping stones. So those seaweeds, of course, it has a negative impact on the fisher folk or the fishing community in Takoradi, but due to the quick thinking and the fast action of the climate actors there, we are finding better ways to utilize those seaweeds to adapt to the changing climate, and that's a good example. I don't know if anyone has any other thoughts they would like to share with us before we dive into how we can integrate human rights into climate change policies and practices. All right, thank you very much. So let's talk about what we can do as we have this conversation about human rights. How can we integrate that into our planning, into our policies, into our practices that will reduce the impacts of climate change? So, of course, the role of human rights in climate change policies. Hello?
Hi, you're audible.
Okay. So let us talk about climate change policies and strategies that we can adopt. The first one I want us to look at is conducting human rights impact assessments. So when you want to carry out a project that has to do with climate change, that has an impact on climate change or on the climate or the environment, you need to carry out an impact assessment, right? And many of you on the call may be familiar with environmental impact assessments. Those ones are more popular because, of course, you have to consider environmental factors, consider how your project, whatever you're doing, has what impact it has on the environment. Is it going to affect flora and fauna? Is it going to displace populations of maybe a particular species and all of that? And that's fantastic. But then, have we considered the human rights impact assessments? What impact would your project have on human rights? I think we gave an example on Monday about carrying out projects that on the surface looks amazing, but then is infringing on the human rights of the indigenous community where you carry out that project. Perhaps you have to displace the population without thinking about compensation for them. A human rights impact assessment would checkmate that, because you would have considered that if we cite this project here, it simply means that these indigenous people who have depended on these forests for their source of livelihood would not have the forest anymore, because we are deforesting large acres or hectares of land to carry out this project. If you're going to cite a project in a location whereby the effluent discharge is going to run off into the river, and there are towns and communities nearby that depend on that river for drinking water, it simply means that those people wouldn't have access to clean water anymore. So this is what a human rights impact assessment does. It helps you to see what are the potential impacts of your activities on the human rights of people. So as you're talking about climate change, some of the projects you are carrying out also have an impact on human beings. Also, you need to ensure that there is participation and engagement of vulnerable and marginalized communities. Yes, we talked about how they are largely impacted by climate change. So whenever you are having discussions or policy deliberations, they also have to be at the table, because there are certain things you would consider or that they will consider that you have not considered. Your policies may be in favor of men. Your policies may be exclusive of children. I'm trying to think of a good example. So if you are going to cite, okay, let me give this example. If you are going to, may not be climate change related. If you're going to cite a borehole in a community, right? You decide, we want to bring development to this community. It's a native community and an indigenous community, and you want to bring development, and you say, I'm going to cite a borehole. The idea behind this borehole is that you don't have to travel long distances anymore to go to the local stream to fetch water. You have the borehole, you have potable drinking water and all of that. And in your head, it sounds really nice and it sounds really wonderful. And then you cite the borehole. But then you forget that the women of the community are those who are tasked with the responsibility of going to fetch that water. And every morning, the women gather together, and at the stream, there are other things they do there. They use that period to unwind and talk about their stresses and laugh and do all that. And the journey back home, the long journey back home, is the opportunity that they have to catch up with their friends and discuss before they get back home and then go to do whatever they have to do. But because the borehole has been sited and they can easily get water and come back, that social component has been lost. And the women don't have that opportunity to interact as much anymore. They don't have that opportunity to share their burdens with one another anymore. So you see how something that was productive, the idea was great. But then there's also a negative impact. That cohesiveness is lost. So this is just an example to show that when designing policy, you could have the best of ideas, you could have the best intentions, the best motives. But if you don't carry everyone around, there's going to be blind spots in the policy that you enact. There's going to be blind spots. And those blind spots, they could be trivial, as what I've just stated, but they could also be significant. So when designing climate change policies, ensure that there is participation and engagement of as many people as possible, as many stakeholders as possible, particularly vulnerable people, marginalized communities. They need to be part of the decision-making processes. If you notice the trend now in our world today, you see that many of the policy makers are involving young people. There's a lot of youth engagement going on. And the reason for that is not just because of tokenization, even though it's part of the motives for that, but it's because these young people, largely because these young people are stakeholders. They are the future. So you're not going to come and enact policies that would affect us in the future. We have to be part of those conversations. So these are some of the things we need to think about. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Also, we need to ensure that we strengthen accountability mechanisms. Yes, accountability mechanisms must be strengthened. We don't want a situation whereby you have strong men and weak institutions. So mechanisms could be judicial remedies, could be national human rights institutions, it could be independent monitoring bodies. Basically, mechanisms that can ensure that these policies are actually working. Those who are responsible for driving actions are actually driving those actions. Those who are contravening the terms can be brought to justice and brought to account. Not just having policies on paper or having laws on paper, but they are not serving any purpose. Not just having things so that you can say, oh yes, we did this, we had this conversation, and then you rinse and repeat when the next cycle comes, and just having those things and not being accountable to them. In the world today, of course, we have the Paris Agreement, which many countries, most of the countries of the world signed up to. And then everyone is supposed to have an adaptation plan. Everyone is supposed to submit their plan, their nationally determined contribution. How are you as a country going to tackle climate change? How are you going to resolve the issues? And everybody just goes through the process of drafting policies, telling us how they're going to reduce climate change emissions from transportation by 23% in the next 4 years, and do this and do that, and do this and do that. And then it's submitted. But at the end of the day, those targets are not met. Or you see that they are taking actions that are in direct opposite to what they said they were going to do. That's what happens when you have weak accountability mechanisms. So you need to ensure that these bodies are strengthened and empowered to take action. Also, another thing you want to do is to develop and implement gender-responsive climate policies. Yes, it's similar to what we mentioned earlier. Ensuring that your policies are gender responsive. climate change affects men and women differently. I just gave an example of how a development project could have an impact, a different impact on women than it would on men. For the men, just go and get your water from the borehole and life goes on. Life has become easier for them. But for the women, it affects them a bit differently because now they've lost that cohesion and that opportunity to speak with other women and to discuss what's going on in society and to have fun and laugh. So it affects men and women differently. So when you have gender responsive policies, it will ensure that the rights of both genders are protected. Let us move on to the next slide. So now we can talk about some recent developments and examples of integrating human rights principles into climate change policies and practices. The first one would be the Paris Agreement. Of course, this is popular, and many of us on the call may already know about the Paris Agreement. So this was enacted in 2015, and it recognizes the importance of human rights in the context of climate change and also calls for protection and promotion of human rights in all climate actions. Then we have the climate justice movement. Of course, it's a growing movement. And then I think on Monday we touched on climate justice as well. And the idea behind this is to draw the attention of people to the rights of human beings, ensuring that human rights principles are integrated into climate change policies, climate change practices, climate change conversations. There must be a sense of justice in every action we take that relates to the climate. In a place like, I think there's this popular example of Flint in the United States where they do not have good water. And that is because, and that place is largely people of color who live there. And that's because they decided to site factories in locations where people of color live. So the effluent discharge and all of that affects those people. So having deliberate policies that are targeted to isolate a certain group of people from the negative impacts and to significantly impact another group of people is injustice. And there must be a rise of this climate justice movement. Everybody needs to voice out, everybody needs to speak about the justice dimension of the climate change conversations if we're going to make any progress and if we're going to even the scale. Then we have the Uganda case. The Uganda case is quite interesting because this was a case of citizens suing their government. It was a landmark case in the Netherlands where citizens took the Dutch government to court, and the court ruled that the Dutch government would have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to a level that will protect the human rights of Dutch citizens. Yeah, that's a very strong case, and it also lays a template for how to engage as a citizen, understanding the role or the power that you have as a citizen of a country. So if you mobilize and take action against the government, you decide what the government does. You decide the direction the government should take. If you feel your country is not paying enough attention to the issues of climate change, you have every right to call them out on it. You have every right to demand that they must be accountable for their actions. Also, we have the Equator Principles. So the Equator Principles, for those who work in the finance sphere or the finance space, maybe you work in banks, you may already be familiar with the Equator Principles. And what the Equator Principles are basically, they are a set of voluntary standards that are designed to help financial institutions to identify, assess, and manage social and environmental risks in projects. It was established in 2003, and many leading banks and financial institutions worldwide recognize and utilize the Equator principles. So the rationale behind this is everything kind of rises and falls on finance. Like if there are big projects you want to carry out, you're probably going to need loans, you're probably going to need financing, right? So the banks can play a crucial role in climate change by determining what projects to fund and what projects they wouldn't fund. Now imagine all the banks in the world are funding only clean energy projects. Imagine all the banks in the world are not funding or withdrawing funding from fossil-based projects. That simply means that we are accelerating our transition to a cleaner society. It simply means that the banks are using their power to influence the direction we go as a people. And that's what the Equator Principles is trying to solve. So through this set of principles, I think there are about 10 of them, they kind of do a risk assessment and evaluate projects and decide if a project is worthy, it should be funded or should not be funded. So they look at how responsible whoever is coming for that loan is, the organization is. They look at the environmental and social assessment. They look at whether they engage stakeholders. They look at their plans for grievance mechanisms. They look at how they are going to monitor and report. They look at their transparency and all of that. So these are some of the things that they consider before they fund a project. So it's human rights components are embedded in the Equator Principles, and it's a good one. We also have the Kenya's Green Climate Fund Readiness Program. Please, I just want to be sure that we are still following. Can you drop comments so far if you are still engaged? Use the emojis if this is still of interest to you. Okay, I see reactions. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So we have another example here, and that's Kenya's Green Climate Fund Readiness Program. So this is a country that is taking action, and they have a readiness program that has been designed to enhance the capacity to assess green climate funds and implement climate change mitigation and adaptation projects. Yes, so if more countries have arrangements like this to assess how ready you are to assess these global funds that are available, it's great because it kind of facilitates the process for deploying financial resources to projects. Financing, as I mentioned in the previous point on Equator Principles, financing is very, very important, and it plays a key role in adaptation and mitigation plans. But if you're not ready to access this funding, then you may not have access to it because these are global funds and there are specific requirements you need to meet as an organization, as a company, for you to access these funds to carry out your climate adaptation or mitigation projects. So with Kenya having a readiness program like this, I think it's a fantastic development. And then Uganda, they have a national adaptation plan. Of course, different countries are developing their national adaptation plans. Some are robust, some not so robust. But we want to talk about Uganda's one, and in their own, there is a particular attention has been paid to gender inclusivity. So their plan has a gender responsive approach that promotes the participation of women in decision-making processes relating to climate change, and that is admirable. Let's move on to the next slide, please.
Ifeanyi.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is it possible for us to do this in like 5 minutes?
Okay.
Thank
Let
you.
me quickly wrap up. Okay, so we also have South Africa's Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Procurement Program, and it also has a strong focus on promoting gender equality, social inclusion, and community participation. So these are some examples. Now let's talk about international and regional frameworks on climate change and human rights. So we have as we mentioned in the last class, we have the UNFCCC. Of course, it's an establishment that's from the United Nations to address climate change and human rights. And we also have the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage, which was established in 2013. And the focus was on loss and damage. Maybe you have been hearing about L&D, and wondering the importance of this conversation. So loss and damage basically has to do with the impact of climate change that communities are unable to avoid through mitigation or adaptation. So, of course, we know that mitigation involves reducing and preventing the emission of greenhouse gases, and adaptation involves making adjustments to social, economic, and environmental practices that minimize the dangers caused by climate change. But loss and damage is a bit beyond this. And in Warsaw in 2013, there was an international mechanism that was set up that was tasked with addressing this. And this is a conversation that has been ongoing for years. I think in the last COP, it took center stage, and African governments and stakeholders are asking that there needs to be financing released, particularly for loss and damage, because Africa is suffering significantly from the impacts of loss and damage. The economies of these countries are suffering, and there needs to be some sense of accountability. So that framework basically, or the mechanism of Warsaw, basically governs these conversations. And then you have the Green Climate Fund, which we have touched a little bit about, and it's another mechanism that basically helps developing countries to adapt to the impacts of climate change, and there's a focus on vulnerable communities. Next slide, please. Then there is the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. This is more regional, and then we have the African Climate Policy Center. So these are some organizations, these are some frameworks that you can engage with in your advocacy work as far as human rights is concerned. These are some basically where you can start from, and by engaging with them, you can begin to gain some traction. Then there's the African business community. You can go through the slides later. There's what we call the UN Global Compact, which is also a voluntary initiative and helps businesses to strategically align themselves to human rights conversations, labor, environment, anti-corruption, and all that. So if I see a company that is subscribed to the UN Global Compact, I, as a business person, would be interested in working with them, because I know that they are working in line with the 10 universal principles of the UNGC, right? And labor concerns are there, environmental concerns are there, anti-corruption is concerned. Anti-corruption is a strong consideration, and human rights definitely. So that is about it. So in terms of what you can do as a young professional, you can start by providing technical expertise and knowledge on the implementation of these frameworks. You can work with these organizations, strengthen advocacy around what they are doing, and draw attention to what they are doing, gather momentum. You can also work as an ambassador for these frameworks. We have the AFCFTC, that's a mouthful, that's the African Free Trade, Continental Free Trade Agreement, which was just signed, which was just ratified. And this is kind of bringing the whole Africa as a marketplace. So it's an opportunity for you to see where you fit in, or where you could bring in conversations about climate change, because when the whole Africa is a marketplace and while it's a win economically, how does it affect? What are the climate change impacts? What are the trade-offs there? Drawing attention to it could also be an opportunity for you as a young professional. I had a conversation recently on a radio station, and they were asking about the climate impacts of the AFCFTA. And I was telling them that it's a win because you have a bigger market to play in. But at the same time, what happens if organizations start to mass produce because they know that they have a bigger market? It's going to mean that there is more pressure on resources. So how do we combat this? How do we combat the adverse effects of climate change due to this free trade agreement that has been set up? So this is just to get us thinking. And by the time you begin to think along these lines, you can begin to plug in some of the blind spots or the holes that have been created by initiatives that generally are been set up for the benefit and the prosperity of the African people. I think I would stop here, and maybe we could have questions if people have any questions to ask, and then Maiwa, over to you.
All right. Thank you very much for this session. Thank you so much. We apologize everyone that there's not a lot of time. We wish that on a day like this we have a lot of time, because human rights essentially is what makes us have that sense of dignity as human beings. And you find out that it's actually still happening in many of our local communities, especially on the African continent that has where the bulk of our GDP comes from the extractive sector. Either we are talking about gold or diamonds and all of them. So we will take this conversation further, but we want to thank our facilitator, Ifeanyi Ohanyere, for this great job he has done. Feel free to get in touch with him. His major work has been on global energy, renewable energy, but most importantly, he can guide us with other aspects of sustainability. He mentioned the human rights risk assessment, human rights due diligence. So if you're thinking of research, I think he's on a research program in the UK. Please feel free. I will get Ifeanyi's social media, so that we can get in touch with him. We would like to take more questions, but if you have specific questions, you can send to me. I would just transmit it to Ifeanyi. For the rest of the session, we thank each and every one of us. Thank you, each and every one of us, for being a part of today's session. We're sorry we won't be able to take any questions for now. So let's just keep going on. Concerning our projects, for those that have not submitted, please ensure that before the end of today, you do that, because it's essential that we bring all of these drafts and start working on them. But in the meantime, for each and every one of us that are on a project, so we are expecting 28 project teams. Please keep carrying out your stakeholder engagements, get plans on the way, so that once it's time, in a week you would have completed your projects. We thank you for today. The recordings of today's session, of course, will be shared shortly. You already have the training materials. Endeavor to work on the quizzes, because then you have many of these things, the policies. Just take active parts, active interest in this programs, and you'll be the better for it. If you have questions or concerns, of course, you can send a DM. Thank you everyone for today. We love you, and peace out. Have a great rest of the day. Bye. Thank you so much, Ifeanyi. I will be in touch. Have a lovely day, sir.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for your attention. I wish you the best as you wrap up your program. Bye.
All right, everyone. The attendance will be shared in your groups.
Thank you.
So you just you can just take it up from there. Bye, everyone.